Hey there, if you're interested in making characters for games and entertainment, then this is the video for you. I've taken 5 years of experience and know-how and put it into a process that takes a character from idea through sculpting, texturing and rigging, and all the way to animation and game engine implementation. And in this video I want to give you an overview of that process, what steps to take, and how simplicity can still yield great and epic results. And a quick disclaimer here, this video is a preview of a full 10-hour narrated course on the same subject. It features everything in the video and much more. And I highly recommend you stick around for the end of the video where I go into more detail about the course. And it's really, I think it's the best course I've ever done. So much great information in one package. Okay, so to start off with, we actually need something to sculpt. We need some sort of idea or visual or concept, and I'll be using this concept I made in my other YouTube tutorial on drawing characters. So this is the character I'll actually be making. And for that initial design I was gathering a bunch of reference, and for this one I'm also gathering some additional reference to help with the 3D process. Those could be examples of other models or references to ways of modeling or something like that, and just general stuff that fits within the criteria. And I'm doing a sort of an action RPG type of character, so I'm gathering reference that fits in those guidelines. When starting out in Blender, I do a very simple blockout, and this is just a really simple blockout of primitives where I'm blocking out the whole body. And I'm starting with the body here of the character itself. That sort of just makes sense. And this blockout is just to get the proportions right. This is really a stage where I focus on getting the extremes right, all the different segments of the body, the arms, the legs, the chest, the pelvis, the head, all those things. And having these separate forms really frees up kind of the utility and the flexibility of moving stuff around, trying stuff, different kinds of things out. And also gives me sort of skeletal meshes to connect everything to later, and just having something solid to connect everything to. When I got that down, then I start introducing these muscle shapes. I'll create these little more round squishy shapes, and then I'll use those to block out the bigger muscles. And this is really where your knowledge of anatomy can help you out. You could also sculpt this out, just going from a solid mesh and then just sculpting the muscles. But I definitely find that when I do the muscle blockout, like I'm showing here, I actually get to an end result a lot faster, because I'm really focusing on getting the sculpt and the muscles right, and I don't fight them as much because I've already placed them and I know where they're all attaching, so it's already in my mind where the stuff like this needs to go. I also think to be able to block out the muscles like this, you need an understanding of the muscles and where they attach, and that's an understanding of the anatomy that you would need anyways for actually sculpting the muscles. But doing it this way sort of proves to yourself that you have that understanding. You can of course always use reference, but I always feel like I'm fighting the anatomy and the sculpt a lot more when I don't have that understanding. And this method kind of keeps me on my toes and makes sure that I'm thinking in the right lanes in terms of anatomy. And you can see after this I am working with a remesh modifier where I can correct everything, and then I apply that remesh modifier, and then I can get into the actual sculpting of the character. And here I can get into sculpting features of the face, marking those things out, and just really building out the model. And this is the sculpting phase proper. And I'm defining muscles, I'm kind of creating muscle strands, building up the volume, figuring everything out here. And this is also definitely where your understanding of anatomy and just form in general really comes into play here. And you can see I'm working a little bit on the smaller areas of the body. I'm starting with kind of head and torso area. It's a lot more interesting for me to do that, so I like starting there. But I will get to the legs a little bit later. And those muscle forms that I've placed here and there, they really help me just as a shorthand to quickly get set up. I'm like, okay, those forms are already there, those extremes are already there, and I'm essentially just kind of filling out the gaps and just reshaping them a little bit. And that's just super helpful, especially for those negative spaces. Like the body has a lot of interesting crevices and spaces here and there that I think sometimes we neglect. Things become very inflated when you're not quite sure exactly how the muscles interact with each other. But with the muscle kind of workflow, it really works out for me in this way. When the sculpt is then more or less done, then we take the full sculpt, and then I'm going to go in and do a retopology. And retopology is essentially where you take like a simpler model and wrap it around the more complex model. The goal is to create a model that you can use for animation, rigging, and texturing, and all these things. And I do it a little bit differently than other areas. This method is very similar to the one I used for the dinosaurs, also on my channel, where I take a simple mesh and then I use some shrink wrap modifiers to wrap this thing around the body here. For me it's a lot faster and a lot simpler, and it yields like kind of 95% good results, and then you just need to tweak it a little bit, and I think for like a third of the time, in my experience. I really recommend this method. I think it's a lot more fun, and it gets you there a lot faster. It doesn't work for everything, but it's quite good for organic things like this. And I think it's also, it can be very kind of peaceful and nice process doing retopology. You're just taking a break and just cleaning stuff up and making nice loops, and you are thinking about creating good topology for deformation, because the character will be animated. So you're thinking a little bit about like, okay, where should I put some extra edge loops, maybe some extra loops around the neck there. You can see it's a little bit low poly. It could use some more detail there, so that when the neck stretches and stuff, there is that resolution to take care of those things. And then when you got all that wrapped around, then you can do little extra details here and there. When I got the retopology more or less completed, then I need to get into applying the high resolution detail to this new mesh, and that happens through the multi-resolution modifier. The multi-res modifier is a really cool modifier in Blender that allows you to sculpt in different layers, and essentially you can take that shrink wrapped retopology model and apply it as sculpting data onto the multi-res modifier, and then on that multi-res modifier we can start doing a lot of the more finer details. So you can see me here going into the face on the multi-res modifier, and with the modifier you can go a lot higher than you can with the traditional just like kind of freeform sculpting workflow. With this you can go up to several million polygons and get that detail. Not something I really need, but it is very nice for getting these cleaner details, and you get to sculpt on a nicer topology, right? This is topology that actually is built around the model and not just like a randomly generated kind of mesh. This topology really works for it. After we got the sculpt more or less done with the multi-res, then I'm getting into making the actual assets, and you can see here I'm making the skirt, and I'm also doing like the belt buckle. And with all the assets, there's not really anything really crazy going on in terms of like methods. It's all just kind of simple edge modeling. Also a nice break of pace from the sculpting here, and you can use a little bit of shrink wrap and different techniques to wrap stuff around the model, especially when doing clothes. I think for the belt I used some stuff like that. And for these sandals I used some curves, and then inflating those curves with some meshes here and just wrapping those things around the skin as well. Super fast, super simple. I'm also doing some detailing here for the helmet. I think little details like that can do a lot for getting the right feel. And here I'm also doing the hood, and just bringing all of the assets together around the character, forming it to the mesh, right? And the cloth also just fairly simple thing, and you don't have to go really crazy with these things. It can stay fairly simple. I'm also doing kind of ropes around this thing, and then I'm doing little knots. I think putting in some attention into doing proper knots is always something that's appreciated, and I think you feel that a lot. Also things with like little clasps and those little attachment points, getting those right, feeling right, even if the rest is simple, often do a lot more than you know, kind of having something really complex and then not binding them together right, if that makes sense. I'm also putting a little bit of extra love into the sword here, so it gets a little bit of detail, and reusing assets here and there. If I make a little asset that could fit somewhere else, like I had a little piece from the bag there and I reused that for the sword and the scabbard, then I really like to do that. When the assets and the model are more or less done, then I can move into UV unwrapping. UV unwrapping is essentially creating seams and laying out some texture tiles so we can do texture paint. And this all happens on the retopologized model. And my plan is to do it separately for the body and for the items and all the assets and stuff. And then I'm essentially going to have two textures I'm gonna have one for the body and one for the assets, and that's so I can exchange the stuff if I wanted a different body or a different item set or something like that. It just kind of makes sense, and it also makes sense with how the stuff might be laid out. Nothing really crazy is going on here. The body is pretty straightforward, but the assets, they require a little bit more of a procedural kind of way of laying out the UI tiles. And while this is done, then I can actually get into doing the texture painting. And for this, I'm going to bring in a reference that I can use to kind of color pick. And I'm going to be starting off doing a lot of the coloring with sculpted vertex colors, actually. And this is where you essentially paint directly on the vertices. So I'm going to give everything a base color, but then I'm going to get into actually painting the skin, for example, and giving that some variation. And using the sculpt vertex colors is just a lot more performant than using the traditional texture painting workflow, because it works under the whole sculpt engine thing. We will need to convert everything into textures anyways at some point, but it's a really good blockout, especially for the body. I'm also using a map here to create some veins as a sort of mask, and then I can use that mask to give it some color variation later on in the shaders. I'm also using a mask to create, for example, this tattoo that the character has on his arm. This is a really fun process. I really like doing this. I could also just paint this directly on with like I did with the body, but creating a mask like this gives me a little bit of extra control in the shader to change the color up or something like that. And now I'm at a point where I got the base color for everything, and that means I can now jump into doing the actual proper texture painting, which means we need to create some clean maps for everything. And the idea is to essentially go into the shader and the baking options, and then bake all the sculpt vertex paint color to these new textures, so we can have everything in a more traditional kind of texture painting workflow, where it's basically pixels on pixels, and that's pretty straightforward in Blender. It takes almost like a couple of minutes or something like that. And I'm also doing that for the items, also again really easy, getting all the items and just baking them to the colors here. And then once I have all those things, and in texture painting, I can jump into the texture painting workflow and literally keep painting on. And that works really well for the helmet, where I'm painting in some rust here and there, giving it some kind of aging variation. And I'm also doing it to several other assets here and there, like the belt and the cloth and the scabbard. Everything is getting a little bit of this treatment, giving it, you know, variations on these things. And with the texture painting, we can also go in and do some variations to the roughness, the shininess of things, which is always super fun to do, feeling it out little by little, just adding a little bit of shine to all the gold bits here and there, just shining it up with the texture painting tool on the different roughness maps for the items here. And I also got the chance to do some of the light bulbs. It's not something that's going to be super visible for this character, as mostly we're going to see it from quite far away, but it's a nice detail to do nonetheless. And then inside the shader, we can do some variations and start defining kind of the roughness for the body also, as that was still just based on the vertex colors. So then I can do some variations there, play around with the ambient occlusion map to get some detail in the crevices, get a little bit of redness in there to give everything a little bit of a definition. A lot of stuff can be done kind of automatically in the shaders to get you really far. When all of that stuff is more or less done, then I'm getting into baking the high-res detail into a normal map. And this is taking that really high detail version from the high sculpt and then recreating it as a normal map, so we can have this really low poly mesh, but then have all this kind of nice detail expressed through a normal map, still super handy. And when I'm more or less done with the model, then I'm going to be going into the rigging phase, and this is a case of putting in the bones and the joints where they need to go. There's many ways of rigging in Blender. You could be using auto riggers or all kinds of tools that help you build humanoid characters, but I definitely find that doing it all from the ground up gives me so much more flexibility. If I'm doing a humanoid character, sure, an auto rigger can work. But if I'm doing a creature or a machine or something just not a human shape, then knowing how I rig things from the ground up is just so essential and gives me immense control. And it also gives me control over the resolution of my character. If I just need very simple stuff, then I have that option, right? And also lets me decide how I want to animate my character. I definitely prefer doing everything with IK. I just like working that way. And making the rig myself, I have that control. Of course, with all rigging comes some skinning. So I'm doing a bunch of skinning here to get stuff right. The auto weights kind of take care of most of the stuff, but a little bit of tweaking is needed. And you could always use blend shapes if you need to. The items almost had to be skinned separately, so I skinned the body by itself first, and then I take care of the items afterwards. Once I got the body working, that's kind of the foundation, and then the items are layered on top afterwards. And there's lots of interesting things here to do. There's the hood, and then later on we'll get to the scabbard here. And the scabbard, also interesting, I'm creating extra bones just for the scabbard, so I have a way of moving that scabbard about as the character is being animated. And that's a really cool thing in Blender. You can always, edit and modify these things as you go along. You don't have to plan out every single thing. The rest of the items are also kind of being just skinned fairly simply, but sometimes you need to go in and skin something by hand. But it's really not a big deal, especially for a character of this style. The cloth was a little bit tricky. That needed its own custom set of bones wrapped around everywhere to be able to have some control over the cloth deformation. Ideally, you could be doing some kind of simming, especially if you're putting it into a game engine or something like Unity or Unreal. But here I just wanted specific artistic control. So I created a set of bones and then skinned it to that. And I actually found a really good way of transforming some automatic weights directly to those bones. And then usually when I've done with my rig, I like to do a bunch of test posing using the rig and just check that everything is working, attaching the sword to the hand, grasping everything. Just do a good pose. That's really the best way to check if you're skinning and your rig is working as intended, and definitely something you should do along the way. And once I have that model, the fully skinned and rigged model, then I can actually get into doing animation. And for that, I'm going to be attaching the sword to the back of the character, and then we can slowly get into posing everything. And what I'm doing is actually hiding out the cloth, as I'm going to be animating the body separately first and just get that foundational movement. And to really understand the walk cycle that I'm about to do here, I like to draw it out for myself. So I actually drew it out and then took those drawings and breakdowns and put it into an animation to really fully understand how I need to think about this thing. I just find that when I draw things, then I just understand the movements a little bit better. It's kind of like when you're writing things down that you're being told, that you just remember a little bit better because you have a separate task associated with those things. As I'm animating the character in 3D, I'm making sure to divide everything up into keyframes, like in the overview, the breakdown of the animation. So I'm doing all the different poses, the contact phase, the passing pose, the floating phase, all the different phases of the run cycle. And I'm making sure along the way to check it from the side and making sure to get a good balance as I start seeing the character from the front and all the different angles in 3D. But maintaining that graphic read as I was uncovering it in 2D is still really essential. And here I'm figuring out a little bit of the timing, which was a really vital part of the animation. I think it can be super fun to break out the keyframes and then just see how playing with the timing just a little bit here and there just gives a totally different feel for the run cycle. And also I'm adjusting the scabbard a little bit to give it some extra weight and reaction as the run cycle walks along. And now I'm getting into the cloth itself and animating that as the legs are kind of kicking the cloth back and forth and these things. It was quite challenging to get this cloth to feel right, and definitely the cloth was also showing its weakness here and there, where it felt good and where it felt bad, and but I think I ended up with a pretty decent result. Definitely good enough for what I was going for. In addition to the run cycle, I also did a slash, kind of like a two-stage slash, where the guy kind of hits in with the sword first and then does a backhanded attack afterwards. And very likewise with the running cycle, this is all about weight. And I think more so than anything for the slash, I really had to do the movement myself. I had to get up and really perform this movement and kind of time out the steps with my own body and like feeling, okay, it goes there and then it goes there. And I think I also ended up with a pretty good result for what I wanted. It kind of ended up working pretty nicely. When I was done with all that, then I took the entire character, the run cycle, and the attack animation, and I began exporting it all as an FBX so I could put it into a game engine. And here I'm putting it into something like Unreal Engine, and I just have this simple top-down sample kit running, and then I'm just bringing the character in, adjusting it with the right textures and these things, and making sure that the normal maps behave correctly. There's always a little bit of tweaking here and there depending on where you're bringing it in, but I got it all working, and it ended up looking really good, and the animation working, and also running in-game as I was kind of running around with the character. And that's pretty much how I brought a character from 0 all the way to a game engine with animation, textures, and everything. And once again, you can check out the full 10-hour course over on Critical Giants/store or over on Gumroad, although it's a bit cheaper over on Critical Giants/store. I think this course is great if you're looking to develop a workflow for characters. I think it's great if you're a Blender user and you're looking to expand your skill set across the board. But I also think that this course can be really useful for those of you coming from a different 3D package and you want to see how you can develop characters in something like Blender. And overall, the course doesn't feature any special add-ons, any special things you need to download or install. The only thing is maybe a UV packer tool. No pre-made assets or textures, we just do it all in Blender. And if you want to try out the model for yourself, either for animation or for game development, then you can try out the model in the Game Ready Character Asset Pack, also on the store. And with that said, I hope that this video was useful and insightful. If you liked it, give it a thumbs up. If you didn't, give it a thumbs down. You can also leave a comment if you have anything to discuss or ask. And if you want to follow us in the future, then subscribe and hit that notification bell.